The story begins inside the prison bathroom, where another inmate warns Bond that a gang is coming to beat him up, but Bond tells him not to get involved and to stay away so he doesn't get hurt. A few moments later, Jay arrives with the rest of his gang. They bribe one of the prison guards to leave the area, then surround Bond from every direction. Jay tells him they came to get revenge because he refused to join their gang. He then pulls out a knife and charges straight at Bond. Bond calmly turns around and says, "I'm going to count to 5, and I don't want to see any of you standing in front of me." The gang laughs at him and doesn't take his warning seriously. As Jay rushes toward him, Bond quickly stabs him in the shoulder, then launches into a brutal fight against the rest of the gang. Despite being badly outnumbered, Bond easily takes them all down, proving that he's an incredibly skilled fighter. Before leaving, he looks at Jay and warns him, "Never stand in my way again." Several months later, Bond is finally released from prison after serving 5 years. He starts looking for a place to live and eventually visits a couple named Roberto and Tamara, who are renting out a room in their house. The house is already shared by 6 people. Tamara shows Bond his new room and tells him there are a few rules he has to follow. Since there are young children living in the house, he must stay away from gangs and never get involved with them. He's not allowed to keep any weapons or illegal substances, and no women are allowed to visit the house. She makes it clear that these are the basic conditions if he wants to stay there. Bond agrees to all of Tamara's rules without any argument, then pays the rent and officially moves into his new home. After that, we move to an illegal underground fighting arena where a huge crowd has gathered to watch the matches and bet massive amounts of money on the fighters. Bond is standing in the audience quietly watching everything. We soon learn that wealthy businessmen own these fighters and make huge profits from the underground fights. One of the biggest names is James, whose undefeated fighter is Hammer. Tonight, Hammer is set to face a fighter known as Cowboy. Cowboy is incredibly fast, but speed alone isn't enough to defeat Hammer. Hammer is one of the strongest and most ruthless fighters in the arena. He brutally overwhelms Cowboy and keeps beating him until he's just about to kill him. Before he can finish the job, Ben Paul steps in and stops the fight, surrendering on Cowboy's behalf. After the match, Ben Paul hands the prize money over to James because his own fighter has lost. As Ben Paul gets into his car to leave, he's shocked to find Bond sitting in the back seat waiting for him. Bond tells him he wants to fight Hammer and offers him 40% of the prize money if he wins. But Ben Paul laughs and says that nobody has ever been able to defeat Hammer. He asks Bond, "What makes you think you're any different?" Bond calmly replies, "Put me in the ring with Hammer, and you'll find out." Ben Paul explains that he just lost a fortune on his last fight and isn't willing to risk any more money. So Bond pulls out his own cash and hands it to him, telling him to place the bet on him instead. Ben Paul finally agrees and decides to give Bond a chance. He takes Bond to meet James. As soon as they arrive, Bond can't stop staring at Angela, James's girlfriend. James immediately notices the way Bond is looking at her, so he pulls Angela close and wraps his arms around her, making it clear that she belongs to him. Ben Paul then introduces Bond as his new fighter. A few moments later, James notices Angela looking back at Bond. He immediately yells at her and threatens to beat her if she ever does it again, then orders his assistant, Teddy, to take her home. Bond quietly watches everything from a distance while Ben Paul arranges his first fight. Before stepping into the ring, Bond carefully studies his opponent and quickly realizes that the fighter relies heavily on his kicks. Once the fight begins, Bond deliberately raises his arm, baiting his opponent into throwing the exact kick he was expecting. His plan works perfectly. Bond counters with a single strike and knocks him out with ease. Ben Paul is overjoyed and tells Bond they're going to make a fortune together. He promises to arrange plenty of fights for him, and once the time is right, he'll finally get his chance to fight Hammer. Bond then asks Ben Paul about Angela. Ben Paul reveals that she was once married to another man and was pregnant with his child, but James framed her husband for murder and sent him to prison. After that, James took Angela for himself. When she gave birth, James took her baby away and placed the child in an orphanage. Ever since then, Angela has been living like a prisoner under James's control. Her life became miserable and she eventually turned to drugs to escape the pain. Ben Paul tells Bond that he hates talking about this story because it's one of the most inhumane things he's ever heard. Meanwhile, James is preparing food for his dogs when Teddy shows him a video of Bond's fight. Teddy points out that Bond knocked his opponent out with a single blow and explains that he's Ben Paul's new fighter. James is clearly surprised by Bond's incredible strength. Later, Bond is playing chess with Roberto when Ben Paul arrives in his car and tells him it's time for another fight. Bond wins the chess match, collects the money he bet with Roberto, and leaves with Ben Paul. When they arrive at the arena, a fight between 2 female fighters is already underway. Veretta defeats her opponent and wins the match. Right after that, Ben Paul walks over to Tato, the manager of the strongest fighters in the area. He bets $50,000 that Bond can defeat Tato's best fighter. Tato accepts the bet and sends his top fighter into the ring. As always, Bond carefully studies his opponent's movements before the fight begins. Then, with one perfectly timed strike, he knocks him out instantly. Tato completely loses his mind and refuses to pay the money. Instead, he tells Ben Paul that Bond now has to defeat 2 of his fighters at the same time if he wants to win the bet. At first, Ben Paul refuses, but Tato pulls out a gun and forces the situation. Bond calmly accepts the challenge. As soon as the fight starts, he takes down the first fighter, grabs the second one, slams slams him to the ground and breaks his arm. Tato can't believe what he's seeing. He immediately raises the bet again and sends 3 fighters into the ring at once. But once again, Bond wipes them all out within seconds. Bond calmly looks at Tato and says, "Now we've won $20,000. Tato is furious and refuses to pay. Bond immediately starts taking down anyone standing in his way until he reaches Tato himself. He beats him up, takes the money by force, and walks away. Watching everything from the sidelines, Veretta is left completely amazed by Bond's incredible skills, so she walks over to him and gives him her phone number. Ben Paul looks at Bond in complete disbelief and says, "I've never seen a fighter do anything like that in my entire life." Suddenly, Tato opens fire on them from a distance, but Ben Paul reacts quickly, jumps into his car, and manages to escape with Bond before anyone gets hurt. From that day on, Bond and Ben Paul start making huge amounts of money from underground street fights. During his free time, Bond spends hours training, and every arena he steps into leaves, the crowd completely amazed by his unbelievable skills. His reputation spreads faster with every fight. Before long, everyone knows Bond as the fighter who simply cannot be beaten, no matter how strong his opponent is. Even more impressive, most of his victories end with a single punch. Thanks to all the money they've been winning, Ben Paul is finally able to buy himself a brand new car. He tells Bond, "I used to feel like a complete failure. I had no money and no future until you came into my life and changed everything." Later, Bond returns home, where Tamara notices the blood on his shirt and immediately asks what happened. She makes him sit down so she can treat his wound. While she's bandaging him, Bond asks why she's awake so late. Tamara tells him she got up to prepare food for the children because she wants to make sure they grow up to become good people instead of criminals. We then learn that all the children living in the house are actually her adopted kids. Bond asks her about one particular boy named Gerald. Tamara explains that Gerald spends most of his time sitting by the window, hoping that one day his parents will come back for him. His father is in prison and nobody knows where his mother is. Tamara then tells Bond that she once saw him practicing Tai Chi and says she really admires it because of how peaceful and relaxing it is. Hearing that, Bond decides to teach her Tai Chi himself. The next morning, Tamara finds Bond teaching Gerald some basic Tai Chi movements. Seeing Bond helping the young boy puts a big smile on her face. Meanwhile, James continues getting rid of anyone who stands in his way. This time, he takes revenge on a woman named Monica after she loses a bet. She desperately apologizes and tries to run away, but James mercilessly kills her. Just before leaving, he notices Roberto nearby and starts wondering if Roberto witnessed everything that happened. That night, the long-awaited fight finally arrives. Hammer is set to face Bond inside the underground arena. Before the match begins, Hammer injects himself with performance-enhancing drugs to boost his strength and endurance. Ben Paul announces that this will be the night's main event as both fighters step into the ring. Hammer immediately charges at Bond, throwing powerful punches, but Bond easily dodges every attack before landing several clean shots of his own. He manages to knock Hammer to the ground, but Hammer quickly gets back on his feet. Bond doesn't give him a chance to recover and unleashes a series of lightning-fast punches that send Hammer crashing down for a second time. Hammer completely loses his focus, and Bond finishes him off with one devastating blow, winning the fight once and for all. Ben Paul can't hide his excitement and immediately goes to collect the prize money from James. James hands him the money and says, "Every dog has his day, and today is yours." After that, James walks over to Bond, congratulates him, and says he's never seen a fighter like him before. He then invites both Bond and Ben Paul to his house to celebrate the victory. Ben Paul refuses the invitation, but Bond surprises everyone by agreeing to go. A few days later, Bond and Ben Paul arrive at James's mansion. James tells Bond that Hammer was taken to the hospital because of the injuries he suffered in the fight. He then introduces them to Angela. This time Angela avoids looking at Bond, but James still notices the strange way Bond looks at her. James takes Bond to his private training room and tells him that he's always admired powerful fighters. He explains that a true fighter should live with honor, stay disciplined, and never use drugs or alcohol. He proudly says that he doesn't touch those things either because, in his own words, he's not a criminal. He adds that this is exactly why he likes Bond. James then asks Bond if he knows how to fight with swords, but Bond admits that he doesn't. Only then does James reveal the real reason he invited him there. He tells Bond that he has a very ambitious plan. He knows a man named Franklin, an international arms dealer who also manages a legendary fighter named Price, widely considered the strongest fighter in the world. Price has already killed 4 opponents inside the ring. James says he wants Bond to challenge Price. However, anyone who wants that fight must first pay $5 million, and James is willing to cover the entire amount himself. He explains that under normal circumstances, Bond's ranking isn't high enough to earn that opportunity, but Franklin will accept the challenge because of James's influence. James promises that if Bond manages to defeat Price, he'll earn enough money to retire for the rest of his life. It's an incredibly tempting offer, but Bond simply tells him that he'll think about it before making a decision. James looks disappointed and replies, "I don't like it when people refuse my offers." A short time later, James catches Angela trying to take another dose of drugs. He snatches it away from her and tells her that if she wants it back, she'll have to do something for him first. He takes her somewhere private and orders her to seduce Bond and convince him to accept the fight against Price. Angela refuses without hesitation, but James threatens her until she has no choice but to obey. She goes to Bond, asks him to come with her to her room, and once they're alone, she suddenly pulls out a gun and points it directly at him, but she's completely stunned when Bond calmly shows her an old photograph of her with her former family. Bond then tells her, "Your husband, Danny, asked me to look after his wife and his son." The moment Angela sees the picture, she breaks down in tears. Looking at Bond with disbelief, she asks him, "Where did you see my husband?" Bond tells Angela that he first met her husband, Danny, in prison. The two of them became close friends and spent a lot of time playing chess together. One day, Danny showed Bond a picture of his family and told him, "When you get out of prison before me, I want you to look after my wife and my son until I come home." But the very next day, Jay and his gang attacked Danny inside the prison and killed him. Bond was devastated by the loss of his friend and blamed himself for not being able to save him. Back in the present, Angela tells Bond that she always knew James was the one responsible for her husband's death. She explains that James did it so she would have nobody left to turn to, forcing her to stay under his control forever. She then tells Bond that she has no idea where her son is, or even if he's still alive, and that all she wants is the chance to find him. Bond calmly looks at her and says, "I know where your son is, and I promise I'll take you to him." At that moment, Angela finally understands why Bond kept looking at her every time they met. She realizes that Bond is the man who came to rescue her from this nightmare. After the two of them reach an agreement, they leave the room together. Bond looks at James and tells him, "I want Angela to come home with me." James agrees, but only on one condition: "You'll do exactly what I ask." Bond accepts the deal. Later, Bond takes Angela to a rehabilitation center and tells her, "I'll reunite you with your son, but first you need to overcome your addiction." The following day, James meets Franklin and hands him $5 million to arrange the fight between Bond and Price. Franklin accepts the money and tells him the fight will take place in 3 days. That night, Bond returns home and is shocked to discover that Roberto has been murdered. Police officers have already surrounded the house and are investigating the crime scene. Bond immediately goes upstairs to check on Tamara. She tells him that 2 men broke into the house and killed Roberto. Bond quickly realizes that James is behind the murder because he suspected Roberto had witnessed him killing Monica. Bond comforts Tamara and stays with her throughout the night until she finally calms down. A few hours later, Gerald wakes them up with alarming news. James has arrived. Tamara quickly takes Gerald outside while James walks in and tells Bond that everything has been arranged for his fight against Price. Bond immediately replies, "We never had a deal. I told you I'd think about it, and after thinking it over, I've decided I'm not fighting." James instantly loses his temper and reaches for his sword, but before he can draw it, Bond attacks him and knocks the weapon out of his hand. James immediately grabs Tamara and holds her hostage, threatening to kill her. However, he's afraid that if he pushes Bond too far, Bond might refuse to fight Price for good. So instead of escalating the situation, James backs off and leaves peacefully. After James is gone, Bond hugs Tamara to calm her down. He gives her a large amount of money and tells her to take all the children somewhere safe until everything is over. Meanwhile, James orders his assistant to send the gang after Ben Paul. Hammer soon tracks Ben Paul down and attacks him, demanding to know where Bond is hiding. But Ben Paul honestly has no idea where Bond is. A few seconds later, Bond suddenly appears and takes down one of James's men. A fierce gunfight breaks out between Bond and the gang. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Bond wipes them all out and successfully saves Ben Paul. Meanwhile, Teddy discovers the rehabilitation center where Angela is staying. He leads James's gang there, and as soon as they burst into her room, they're shocked to find Ben Paul hiding under the blanket with a gun already aimed at them. Before they can react, Bond suddenly appears from behind and quickly takes them all down, knocking them unconscious. When James calls his men to check what happened, Bond answers the phone instead and tells him, "I'm coming for you, and this ends today." Knowing Bond is on his way, James comes up with a plan to force him into the fight against Price. He deliberately sends Bond his location, then immediately heads to Franklin's mansion so the fight can take place right away. A short time later, Bond takes the bait and arrives at Franklin's estate. The moment he walks inside, one of the guards points a gun at him and forces him into the fighting arena, where dozens of heavily armed men are already waiting. James looks at Bond and says, "You're fighting whether you like it or not. If you refuse, I'll kill you right now. Then I'll send my gang after Tamara and the children. And after that, I'll kill your friend, Ben Paul." Bond confronts James and accuses him of murdering Roberto. James smirks and replies, "Unfortunately, Roberto knew things he was never supposed to know, so I had no choice but to kill him." Bond then makes a clever move, tricking James into admitting that he was also the one who arranged Danny's murder inside the prison. Only then does everyone realize that Bond has secretly recorded the entire conversation. He immediately sends the recording to Ben Paul, who forwards it straight to the police. Just then, Price finally steps into the arena and tells Bond, "Come on, let's begin." Price underestimates Bond and believes he'll kill him with ease. The fight finally begins. From the very first exchange, it's clear that both fighters are evenly matched. Their speed is unbelievable, and they continuously exchange powerful combinations while showing off incredible fighting skills. Eventually, Price manages to knock Bond to the ground and tries to pin him down, forcing him to surrender, but Bond suddenly lands a powerful strike, breaks free, and gets back on his feet. At that moment, Price realizes he's facing the toughest opponent he's ever encountered. Bond responds with a series of devastating kicks that Price fails to block, sending him crashing to the floor. Bond traps Price's leg and has the perfect opportunity to break it and end the fight, but instead, Bond chooses to surrender. As a result, Price is officially declared the winner. Bond does this for one reason only, to make sure James loses everything after betting $5 million on the fight. James explodes with rage after losing the money and immediately draws his sword, charging straight at Bond. Bond effortlessly avoids every attack. Watching the fight, Franklin orders one of his men to hand Bond a sword, so the duel will be fair. To everyone's surprise, Bond turns out to be an expert swordsman. It becomes clear that he lied to James when he claimed he didn't know how to use a sword. James can't land a single hit on Bond. Bond completely outclasses him, and after an intense sword fight, he delivers the final blow, cutting off James's hand. Moments later, the police arrive at the mansion. Bond escapes before anyone can stop him. Several months later, Angela is finally released from the rehabilitation center and is reunited with her son. Gerald can't believe that he's seeing his mother again for the very first time. Angela hugs him tightly and says, "I'll never leave you again." With his mission finally complete, Bond decides it's time to leave the house. Tamara is surprised to learn that Bond came there from the very beginning because of Gerald, and that everything he did was to fulfill his promise to Danny and protect his family. But Bond doesn't stop there. He tells Tamara that he has left an envelope filled with money for Angela and her son so they can build a new life together. After saying goodbye, Bond walks outside, where Ben Paul is waiting for him. Ben Paul asks Bond to stay, suggesting they keep fighting in the underground arenas and make even more money together. But Bond simply smiles and replies, "I've still got a lot of things I need to do." The two friends say their goodbyes, and Bond walks away, continuing his journey. And that's how the movie comes to an end. What do you think? Was Bond right to risk everything to fulfill his promise to his friend Danny and save his family? Or should he have walked away and started a new life after getting out of prison? Let me know your opinion in the comments.